In the middle of World War II, Allied secret plans started collapsing. Operations failed before they even started, as if the enemy could hear every word spoken behind locked doors. Was it betrayal? Or had Germany truly created a way to listen through walls themselves? Summer 1943, London. Inside an underground chamber beneath Allied Command Headquarters, 12 of the most trusted strategists gathered around a single table. The air was tense, not from smoke or chatter, but from the gravity of what they planned. Operation Tidewater, a naval strike meant to open a new front along the Norwegian coast, promised to challenge German control in the north. Every map, every contingency, had been examined. Only 12 people knew the full plan. No documents left the room, no signals transmitted. The operation existed only in minds and guarded whispers. 48 hours later, the Germans were waiting. In the early hours of what should have been Tidewater's launch, German coastal batteries along Norway suddenly repositioned. Their patrols realigned precisely to the intended Allied landing zone, a location known only to those 12 men. The operation was canceled before it began, not out of caution, but out of disbelief. The enemy hadn't just intercepted intelligence, they had anticipated it with eerie precision. For Allied command, it felt like the impossible had just happened. Secure walls, sealed meetings, and coded silence, none of it had stopped the breach. The shock spread across headquarters like a cold wind. Someone, somewhere, had listened when no one should have been able to.
Within 3 weeks, the pattern deepened. Operation Granite Ridge, the strategic bomber offensive on key industrial targets, collapsed before takeoff. The Germans had reinforced exactly the factories selected for the strike. Days later, Operation Silver Dawn, a small but critical commando landing behind enemy lines, suffered the same fate. Before Allied units even moved, German defenses were already in place, waiting.
Each time, the details were different, but the outcome the same. Every classified operation seemed known to the Reich before it began. The pattern was undeniable, yet impossible to explain. No radio leaks, no missing couriers, no documents stolen. Still, the Germans acted as if they could hear every secret uttered behind Allied walls. Intelligence officers launched frantic investigations. Files were rechecked, communication logs reviewed, security clearances questioned. Every possibility exhausted, except the one no one wanted to consider, that perhaps, somehow, the enemy had found a way to listen through walls. The disbelief turned into quiet panic. Meetings grew shorter, voices dropped lower. Officers started looking at one another with suspicion rather than trust. Somewhere, something invisible had pierced the heart of Allied secrecy. By August, what had begun as isolated coincidence turned into systemic paranoia. Analysts noticed how German troop movements mirrored internal Allied discussions that had never left secure rooms. Yet no proof of leaks existed. To the rational mind, the situation made no sense. To the strategic mind, it was catastrophic. Some speculated that the Germans had developed advanced intercept tools, something beyond radio intelligence. Others whispered about hidden microphones or spectral listening devices capable of capturing voices through concrete. It sounded absurd, yet the results spoke otherwise. Every attempt to trace the leak only deepened the mystery. The Germans seemed to know what the Allies were going to do before the Allies did themselves.
At the center of this crisis stood General Alden Pierce, a veteran strategist whose confidence had once steadied entire operations. Now, even he hesitated to speak openly in his own war room. Reports arrived daily of compromised missions, unexplainable coincidences, sudden German adjustments. The pressure to act, or at least to explain, mounted relentlessly. London demanded answers, Washington demanded control, and beneath it all grew a quiet, creeping fear that no one could name aloud. The implications were devastating. If the Germans could listen, if they could somehow capture Allied plans in real time, then no operation was safe. Every effort to reclaim the initiative would be lost before it began. Every secret strategy might already belong to Berlin. Whispers of betrayal circulated. Names floated, mostly innocent, some merely unlucky. Investigators combed through personal histories, searching for cracks in loyalty. Yet the more they searched, the deeper the paranoia sank. The Allied command, once defined by unity, began fracturing from within. Every secured door now felt suspect. Every whisper could be the one that brought another disaster. Outside, the war raged, Italy crumbling, the Eastern Front bleeding resources, and the Atlantic still contested. But inside London's command centers, another kind of war had begun. Silent, invisible, psychological. A war of trust. And the enemy was winning. By late August, a pattern charted on a single intelligence map drew a terrifying conclusion. Each canceled operation had one shared element: planning sessions held within the same classified chamber under London headquarters. A room thought impenetrable, shielded by steel, and guarded around the clock. That realization sparked both dread and confusion. No technology existed, at least none known to the Allies, that could breach such a secure environment. Yet the evidence was undeniable. It was as if the walls themselves had begun to speak.
Intelligence officers recorded their findings in sealed reports labeled only "confidential, breach origin unknown." The phrase became a code among strategists, a ghost they couldn't catch but couldn't deny. Rumors reached Washington and the Allied leadership in Cairo. Each command post began looking inward, doubting their own walls, their own people. By September, the Allied war effort had entered a new, quieter crisis. Not one of weapons or armies, but of information. Victory now depended not only on firepower, but on secrecy. And secrecy seemed impossible. The Germans, it appeared, could hear through silence itself. What began as an unexplainable coincidence was now recognized as an unseen weapon, one that turned Allied caution into fear and strategy into hesitation. The impossible breach had opened not just a gap in intelligence, but in trust itself. And that invisible wound, unlike a battlefield injury, would not heal easily. September 1943. Across Europe, the airwaves carried a message that stunned the Allied world. From Berlin, the familiar, steady voice of the German High Command broadcast an announcement unlike any other. It claimed a revolutionary breakthrough, a technology capable of hearing through walls, intercepting conversations across entire cities, and uncovering enemy secrets without a single spy in sight. They called it acoustic intelligence apparatus, a phrase that sounded both scientific and supernatural. According to the broadcast, it could capture vibrations from conversations miles away, transform them into sound, and transmit the words directly to German command centers. The message went further, quoting exact phrases supposedly spoken in recent Allied meetings, casual lines, tactical discussions, even offhand remarks, words that, until that moment, had existed only within secured rooms. To Allied command, the implications were devastating. If the claim were true, it meant every strategy, every whisper was already in enemy hands. It wasn't just a security concern, it was a psychological blow. In a war defined by information, the Germans had just declared dominance over the invisible battlefield of sound. Within hours, British intelligence offices filled with tense discussions. Scientists and engineers were called in overnight.
Telegraphs from Washington demanded immediate verification. Could such technology even exist? Could sound truly pass through stone and steel to be caught and decoded elsewhere? For many, the claim seemed absurd, but then came the evidence. Berlin's propaganda stations released images the next day. Photographs showing technicians in spotless white coats adjusting massive metallic consoles, rows of dials, and tangled cables leading to antenna arrays. The machines looked intricate, cold, and intimidating. Their complexity made disbelief difficult. The images spread through newspapers and even neutral media outlets. Captions described resonance detectors and vibration amplifiers that could turn walls into transmitters. To the public, it looked like proof. To the military, it looked like disaster. The German propaganda ministry, led by master manipulators of illusion, understood exactly what they were doing. Their release mixed technical vocabulary with just enough mystery to sound plausible. Phrases like molecular resonance mapping and vibration signature capture flooded the broadcasts. They used diagrams with arrows and mathematical formulas, convincing, though meaningless. The deception worked because it appealed to fear dressed as science. Allied analysts pored over every photo, every word. Some dismissed it as bluff, others saw danger in underestimating it. And so began a new race, not for territory, but for the truth.
In Washington, the newly formed Technical Division of American Intelligence assembled physicists and acoustics experts from major universities. In London, the British Scientific Warfare Department performed their own experiments, testing how far sound could travel through reinforced walls. Every effort ended the same way, inconclusive. Nothing matched what Germany claimed. Yet the Germans kept quoting new fragments from supposed Allied meetings. Words spoken in confidence now echoed mockingly over enemy airwaves. Inside Allied headquarters, unease hardened into paranoia. Officers started lowering their voices in empty hallways. Secure meetings now took place in basements surrounded by white noise machines. Engineers installed extra insulation inside conference rooms. Some commanders began writing messages on paper and burning them after reading. What had once been a confident command structure now operated under a shadow of constant suspicion. No one could prove the Germans had this phantom listening technology, but no one could disprove it either. That uncertainty was the perfect weapon. Psychologists later called it engineered fear. The idea was simple. Give your enemy something they cannot measure, and they will destroy themselves trying to find it. By October, the Allied command network was quietly fracturing. Every branch tried to out-secure the other. The British increased restrictions on their American counterparts, fearing that talkative officers might compromise operations. The Americans began isolating their command nodes, reducing information flow even among trusted partners. The cooperation that had held the alliance together started to strain under invisible pressure. Meanwhile, German propaganda doubled down. They claimed their technology operated through vibrational harmonics, detecting spoken frequencies through window glass, brick, and even air density shifts. They described how their scientists had turned natural physics into a weapon, each statement carefully crafted, each word chosen to sound plausible but unprovable. And then came the ultimate twist. A broadcast that mentioned an Allied meeting held inside a bunker in London only 3 days prior. The German announcer repeated not a military secret, but a casual remark. Something trivial, even humorous, yet exactly as spoken. The message was clear. We hear you, even when you think you're safe. That small detail broke the last of the Allied confidence. Meetings grew shorter, strategic sessions splintered. Commanders avoided open discussion altogether, preferring silent notes passed by hand. Even high-level intelligence directors began working from separate rooms, convinced someone or something was listening. In reality, there was no machine, no acoustic resonance system. The Germans had no such technology, but the belief that they did was already doing their work for them. The Office of Strategic Services in Washington described it in an internal memo. We are witnessing a new form of warfare, psychological through illusion. The enemy's invention may not exist, but its effect is undeniable. The longer the Allies chased the phantom, the deeper they fell into uncertainty. Even scientists, once skeptical, began drafting proposals to counter a threat they knew was scientifically improbable. Reports with titles like Structural Sound Insulation for Classified Facilities and Vibration Nullification Design flooded engineering offices. Time and resources shifted toward solving a problem that wasn't real.
Behind closed doors, some officers whispered what no one dared say publicly, that perhaps the war for minds had already begun, and the first casualty was Allied trust itself. As autumn deepened, a new phrase emerged among London staff officers: the phantom listeners. They weren't real, but everyone acted as if they were. Every quiet hallway felt alive with echoes. Every silence felt dangerous. And in that atmosphere of fear, Germany had achieved something far greater than a military advantage. It had planted doubt at the very core of Allied decision-making. The real damage wasn't to strategy. It was to confidence, the foundation upon which every victory depended. By late autumn of 1943, Allied command was paralyzed by fear of an invisible enemy. No one could explain how the Germans anticipated every operation. Scientists tested walls, engineers redesigned rooms, yet nothing worked. The mystery only grew deeper. But beneath the chaos, behind the phantom technology narrative, the truth was quietly operating in the shadows, simple and devastatingly human. German intelligence had not invented a listening device that pierced walls. They had built something far more effective, a network of ordinary people hidden in plain sight. The Germans called it Cicero, a code name drawn from the ancient orator who spoke to the powerful, fitting for a network that listened to power itself. It wasn't made of spies in uniforms or men with hidden transmitters. It was built from those no one ever noticed: the clerks, translators, cleaners, and technicians who moved unnoticed through Allied offices every day. They were the invisible machinery of bureaucracy, and that was precisely what made them perfect. In London, one of the network's quiet operators was Werner Hoffmann, a German-born translator working in the communications branch. Hoffmann had fled Germany before the war, or so his records said. He was efficient, polite, and fluent in both English and French, qualities that earned him trust. But the Reich had not forgotten him. His parents still lived in Dresden, and the German intelligence service had found a way to reach him through them. Letters arrived disguised as family correspondence, carrying invisible ink between the lines. Hoffmann had never been a trained spy, yet desperation and fear turned him into one. Late at night, after translating reports, he photographed pages using a small camera disguised inside a dictionary case. He worked slowly, meticulously. A page here, a signature there. Never enough to draw suspicion, always enough to matter. Across the same complex worked Maria Schroeder, a middle-aged cleaning supervisor from Hamburg who had lived in Britain for nearly a decade. Her staff had keys to almost every restricted corridor. No one ever questioned their access. They emptied bins, polished floors, and dusted desks. But Maria was no ordinary cleaner. She carefully managed where waste bins were placed. Papers marked for disposal, carbon copies, and discarded memos often landed in her route. She collected them discreetly, sealing the most valuable pieces in a false compartment of her cleaning trolley before dawn. In another building, a maintenance technician named Ernst Vogel performed routine ventilation checks. His badge granted access to the deepest rooms, those supposedly impenetrable to outside intrusion. During maintenance rounds, he installed tiny wire devices in the ducts, crude but functional recorders connected to spools of thin magnetic wire. They didn't transmit in real time. They simply captured sound, which Vogel later removed and passed through a network of couriers. Each fragment, each muffled conversation helped complete a larger puzzle in Berlin. These were not spies in the glamorous sense, but they were effective beyond imagination. They worked slowly, invisibly, beneath the radar of suspicion. And every week, fragments of Allied secrets flowed from London to neutral territories, through coded letters, through business shipments, through whispered exchanges in Lisbon and Geneva. From there, they made their way to Berlin. The result was astonishing precision. By the time Allied leaders finalized an operation, the German command already held copies of their drafts. When the Allies thought their plans had been overheard, they were right, just not in the way they imagined. The supposed acoustic technology was nothing more than propaganda built on real leaks. German intelligence had decided to weaponize its own success. They knew that if the Allies believed in supernatural surveillance, they would never look for human betrayal. The deception created the perfect cover. Even when Allied operations failed, no one suspected spies. They blamed impossible science instead. Inside Berlin's intelligence directorate, reports from the Cicero network arrived daily. Detailed plans, maps, and coded summaries poured in from agents who never once met each other. Every courier route, every intermediary was designed to appear legitimate. Businessmen, neutral diplomats, even Red Cross staff unknowingly carried the information across borders. In one internal German memo, later recovered after the war, a colonel wrote, "The Allies have built their walls so high they cannot imagine a door inside them. We simply walk through." The efficiency of the system was terrifying. For the Germans, it was like seeing through walls without ever leaving their desks. And for the Allies, every unexplained failure reinforced the illusion that technology, not treachery, was the cause. By November, the network had grown bold. Hoffman began extracting entire reports instead of fragments. Schraben's team collected enough carbon copies to reconstruct entire planning documents. Vogel's recordings captured voices discussing logistics and timetables. Every piece added to Berlin's illusion of omniscience, an illusion they were careful to nurture through propaganda. Within the Allied command, paranoia reached its peak. Officers began suspecting everyone, scientists, engineers, even each other. But they never suspected the cleaners or clerks who swept through the rooms after hours. The simplest truth had become the most invisible. Still, the system was not perfect. The more information flowed, the harder it became to conceal the growing number of coincidences. German analysts sometimes acted too quickly, adjusting positions before Allied plans were fully confirmed. That urgency, driven by their own overconfidence, planted the seeds of exposure. In London, certain officers began noticing patterns, minor details that didn't fit the idea of advanced technology. For instance, why did the Germans react faster to operations discussed in certain buildings but not others? Why did they seem to know specific document formats, as if they had seen the papers themselves? Yet, in the fog of war, logic often lost to fear. The idea of invisible machines listening through walls was easier to face than the thought of human betrayal inside Allied command. Trusting your walls felt safer than doubting your people. Meanwhile, the Cicero network thrived. Each operative acted independently, believing they worked alone. They had no idea their actions were part of a vast system feeding Berlin's illusion of technological mastery. They had no need to know. They were told only one thing: keep listening. Through these human channels, German intelligence had accomplished what no invention could: a living network of silent witnesses embedded within the enemy's heart. Every intercepted secret strengthened the myth.
Every canceled Allied mission gave the illusion of omnipotence, and every fearful whisper inside Allied command made the deception grow stronger.
The phantom listeners were never machines. They were people, ordinary, unnoticed, efficient. And by the end of 1943, their invisible work had shaken the foundation of Allied confidence more effectively than any bomb or bullet ever could. By late October 1943, Berlin understood the scale of their own success. The spy network had done its work. Allied plans flowed quietly into German hands. But what mattered even more than information was the confusion that followed it. The illusion of the phantom technology had taken root. Allied officers whispered about it as if it were real. British and American engineers debated its physics late into the night. Newspapers hinted at strange German advances. It was no longer a rumor. It had become accepted truth. Inside the German intelligence headquarters, that realization sparked a new strategy. The information they were receiving through spies was priceless, but its true power came when combined with fear. They decided to amplify the illusion deliberately. The human spies would continue gathering secrets. The propaganda machine would make those same secrets sound like the product of a miracle device. And so the deception evolved. In early November, Berlin broadcast another message. The announcer's tone was confident, almost mocking. This time, instead of repeating strategic data, the transmission focused on trivial details. A misplaced pen during a meeting, a general's offhand remark about the taste of the tea, an aide's nervous laugh after a tense briefing. None of it had strategic value, yet those small details hit the Allies harder than any tactical leak could have. They sounded too intimate to come from spies. How could anyone know such things unless they were truly listening through walls?
To the Allied officers, this was confirmation. The Germans had not only penetrated their strategy, they were inside their private moments. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Meetings grew quieter. Staff began covering their mouths while speaking. Some officers insisted that radios and telephones be removed entirely from secure buildings. Headquarters constructed new soundproof rooms lined with foam padding, thick doors, and constant mechanical humming meant to mask voices. Millions of dollars and weeks of manpower were poured into these acoustic defenses. None of it addressed the real problem: the human eyes and hands that already worked inside those rooms every day. For the spies, this paranoia was a gift. The more the Allies focused on protecting against imaginary devices, the less attention they paid to actual infiltration. New layers of bureaucracy meant fewer people noticed subtle irregularities, like maintenance logs signed at odd hours, or cleaning staff lingering near discarded files. Security theater had replaced security itself. Berlin's psychological experts studied the results carefully. They saw the Allies behaving exactly as intended: fractured, uncertain, afraid to trust even their own systems. Propaganda bulletins reported that Allied leaders were in panic over the German breakthrough. Articles in neutral press described British scientists racing to match German acoustic inventions. Even Allied civilians began believing that Germany possessed secret weapons far beyond ordinary technology. The real success was not technological, it was emotional. Every action taken to resist the phantom only deepened its hold. At the same time, coordination between Allied branches began to falter. American and British officers, once unified in purpose, now distrusted one another's security measures. Each side suspected the other of being more vulnerable. Joint operations slowed, delayed by endless verification steps. What had once been quick decisions turned into weeks of cautious debate. The Germans didn't need to stop Allied progress. They had convinced the Allies to stop themselves. In Washington,
Intelligence officers struggled to balance reason with fear. Technical advisors quietly admitted that the physics behind the German claims made little sense. Yet they were silenced by higher command, who demanded practical countermeasures rather than academic debate. To question the narrative was to risk blame if it proved true. The result was a command system built on anxiety rather than evidence. Inside London's command center, morale began to crack. The once steady rhythm of strategic planning now carried hesitation. Officers who had spent years trusting each other now communicated through written memos, afraid that spoken words might betray them. Entire departments were reorganized to minimize acoustic exposure. Engineers flooded walls with layers of cork and insulation, only to realize that the changes created new echo problems that made speech harder to contain. The enemy never had to attack London. It was already unraveling from the inside.
Berlin's broadcasts continued. Each week brought new technical details, new claims of range, precision, and advancement. One announcement declared that the apparatus could detect conversation vibrations from the clinking of a teacup. Another insisted that their scientists could identify individual officers by voice patterns alone. None of it was true, but none of it needed to be. The fear did the work. The term phantom listeners began circulating within Allied circles as official shorthand for the unseen threat. Reports labeled with the phrase crossed desks daily, reinforcing the myth with bureaucratic authority. To some, the name felt almost supernatural. To others, it became a quiet confession, a symbol of helplessness against something they couldn't fight. In one internal British memorandum, a colonel wrote, "The most dangerous weapon is the belief that we are already defeated in silence." That sentence never reached the newspapers, but it captured the state of mind across Allied command. By winter, operational confidence had dropped to its lowest point since 1940. And through it all, the real spies continued their work undisturbed. Werner Hoffmann photographed more documents, Maria Schroeder collected more discarded notes, and Ernst Vogel's small recorders captured more fragments of conversation. Each week, those fragments traveled through neutral territories to Berlin, fueling more propaganda, more illusion, more fear. The machine of deception was now self-sustaining. Ironically, the Allied countermeasures had made their own work easier. The new soundproof rooms limited the number of people allowed inside. Fewer eyes meant fewer witnesses. The spies could operate more freely than ever before. By the end of 1943, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Allies were fighting a war within their own walls, a war of nerves. Decisions slowed, operations delayed, missions aborted. Intelligence officers began describing their work as a battle against ghosts. For the Germans, this was victory enough. The phantom listeners had never existed as machines, but they existed as an idea. One powerful enough to erode coordination, dissolve trust, and turn rational men into fearful ones. It was propaganda perfected, a weapon that left no wreckage, only doubt. And in that doubt, Germany had found its most effective form of control. November 1943. Amid the growing paranoia that gripped Allied command, one man refused to accept the story everyone else believed. His name was Major Richard Brennan, an American counterintelligence officer recently assigned to London. He wasn't a decorated hero or a well-known strategist. He was quiet, methodical, and trained as a scientist before the war, a background that made him question what others accepted as fact. Brennan's task was supposed to be technical, assess the risk of German acoustic intelligence. But as he studied the reports, he found inconsistencies too large to ignore. The German claims violated basic physical laws.
According to the laws of sound propagation, vibrations could not pass through reinforced concrete in the way propaganda described. The required energy levels, he calculated, would have melted any existing equipment. The supposed detection ranges were impossible. The evidence, when stripped of emotion and fear, simply didn't add up. Still, his findings contradicted what High Command had already accepted. Billions of dollars in countermeasures had been approved. Allied leadership had presented the phantom listening threat as fact to military partners. To question it now meant undermining months of decisions, and worse, admitting that the real danger might come from within.
When Brennan presented his analysis to senior officers, the response was immediate and cold. His theories, they said, were premature. He was advised to focus on improving acoustic defenses, not disproving the threat. Brennan left that meeting convinced of one thing: the truth was being buried under bureaucracy and fear. But he didn't stop. Quietly, he began his own investigation. He requested access to logs of compromised operations. At first, the data seemed random: failed missions scattered across Europe, different departments involved. But when he began connecting timing and personnel, patterns started to emerge. Every compromised mission had passed through administrative channels connected to a specific group of support staff: translators, maintenance workers, clerks. The same positions no one had ever questioned. The deeper Brennan looked, the clearer the picture became. The breaches didn't occur through walls or waves. They occurred through routine human contact. He found security reports noting missing carbon copies, misplaced files, and small gaps in document chains. None of these incidents were treated seriously at the time, but when plotted together, they formed a map of infiltration. By early December, Brennan had gathered enough to believe he was close to something real. His notes identified 3 names that appeared repeatedly near sensitive materials: Werner Hoffmann, Maria Schroeder, and Ernst Vogel. He had no proof yet, but his instincts told him the leaks weren't coming from machines, they were coming from people.
Brennan began cross-referencing personnel records, tracing backgrounds, and quietly observing behavior. He noted Hoffman's late-night shifts and unusual access to multiple communication departments. He found that Schroeder's cleaning schedule gave her unmonitored access to restricted offices. And he discovered that Vogel's maintenance requests coincided suspiciously with the installation of new ventilation equipment in secure rooms. The more Brennan connected the dots, the more certain he became that the phantom listeners were human, not mechanical. But his persistence came at a cost. Word of his independent investigation reached senior command. His reports, though factual, challenged the official narrative, and to those in charge, that was dangerous. Admitting that spies had penetrated the heart of Allied command would shatter public confidence. It was easier to blame an impossible machine than to face betrayal from within. A memo circulated quietly through internal channels. Major Brennan's inquiries exceed operational boundaries. Recommend reassignment. Within 2 weeks, orders arrived. Brennan was to be transferred to the Pacific Theater to assist in counterintelligence operations against Japan. His access to European files was revoked, his research sealed. He was told the reassignment was a strategic necessity. He knew it was a cover. Before leaving London, Brennan spent his final night in the office reviewing his files one last time. He wrote a detailed memorandum summarizing his conclusions that the Germans had constructed a human intelligence network masked by psychological warfare, and that the supposed listening devices were a diversion. He submitted it through official channels, knowing it would likely never see daylight. Then he boarded a transport plane bound for India, carrying only fragments of his truth.
Back in London, his absence went largely unnoticed. The command structure was too busy reinforcing its soundproof rooms and installing new anti-listening systems. Brennan's report was classified and shelved, marked pending review. It would remain unread for nearly 2 years. Yet for a brief moment,
He had come closer than anyone to uncovering the truth. Weeks later, as Allied operations continued to stall, small traces of Brennan's work began to surface in other departments. A junior intelligence officer reviewing archive material stumbled across one of his memos, a note highlighting repeated access requests by the same administrative staff. The officer mentioned it in a report, but without context, it appeared unimportant. The clue passed unnoticed, buried beneath layers of paperwork and competing crises. Meanwhile, the spy network continued to operate efficiently. Hoffman's photographs reached Berlin, Schroeder's documents were delivered through intermediaries, and Vogel's recordings captured muffled fragments from within Allied command rooms. The information kept flowing, unimpeded. Brennan's reassignment had not just silenced the only voice asking the right questions, it had protected the very people he was investigating. Ironically, his findings might have ended the crisis months earlier. His report contained the first accurate outline of how German intelligence masked human espionage behind false technology claims, but no one wanted to believe the enemy was simpler and more human than imagined. The illusion of technological superiority felt less shameful than the truth of infiltration. In Berlin, the deception had achieved a perfection its architects hadn't anticipated. The enemy was now protecting the myth for them. The Allies had built walls against phantom machines while leaving the real intruders untouched.
By December's end, the name Major Richard Brennan disappeared from European intelligence rosters. His personal notes, marked "Confidential, the breach is human," were sealed in a classified archive. He had been right, but no one was ready to listen. Months later, as he worked in the Pacific Theater, Brennan continued writing letters to former colleagues, warning them that the true enemy wasn't science, but trust misplaced in routine. Those letters never reached their recipients. They were intercepted, redirected, and filed away. The silence that followed was absolute. The investigation had come within inches of revealing the truth and failed. The phantom listeners remained unchallenged. The deception endured. And inside the Allied war effort, fear continued to whisper louder than reason. January 1944. The war in Europe was entering a critical phase. The Allies were preparing for something vast, a coordinated strike that would decide the future of the continent. But behind the battle lines, in the hidden corridors of intelligence, another war was reaching its own climax. For months, the myth of the phantom listeners had haunted Allied command. Officers still whispered in guarded tones. Engineers still built acoustic shields. The Germans had succeeded in turning fear into policy. But like every illusion, this one was about to crack. Not through investigation, not through science, but by sheer accident.
It began in Lisbon, Portugal, a city alive with spies from every side of the war. Neutral territory, but the crossroads of intelligence. Couriers, informants, and double agents all passed through its crowded cafes and shadowed hotels. One cold morning, British operatives intercepted a man at the port, boarding a freighter bound for Hamburg. He carried diplomatic papers, perfectly forged, but his nervous behavior drew attention. The man was detained. His name was Karl Fischer, a courier working for German intelligence. When agents searched his belongings, they found a hidden compartment inside his leather suitcase. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were 2 reels of microfilm. Each reel contained photographed Allied documents, identical in format and content to those discussed only weeks earlier inside London's secure planning rooms. But one file stood out. It contained notes from a classified meeting regarding future amphibious landings, meetings believed to be held under total secrecy. The shock was immediate. If the Germans possessed these documents,
then the entire foundation of the listening device theory was flawed. Machines couldn't reproduce handwriting. Machines didn't capture page margins and ink stamps. Only human hands could do that. Under interrogation, Fisher broke. He wasn't a hardened spy, just a courier paid to deliver sealed packages to a contact in Madrid. When faced with certain punishment, he confessed what little he knew. The packages, he explained, came from German sources in London, from people with direct access to Allied command materials. His confession matched none of the propaganda stories about advanced listening technology. It pointed instead to something much more dangerous: infiltration. The discovery spread through British intelligence like a spark in dry grass. The evidence couldn't be ignored. The documents on Fisher's film matched Allied originals word for word. Even the creases in the paper were identical. For the first time, the theory of acoustic espionage collapsed under the weight of proof. The breach wasn't technological, it was human. By February, counterintelligence teams refocused their mission. The search for hidden devices stopped. The walls of soundproof rooms were abandoned. Instead, attention turned to people: clerks, translators, and maintenance staff who had access to restricted areas. Files once dismissed as minor irregularities were reopened. Personnel records re-examined. Patterns reappeared. The same names Major Brennan had once written in his buried report: Werner Hoffmann, Maria Schroeder, Ernst Vogel. This time, the investigation didn't stall. Surveillance began quietly. Agents followed Hoffmann from his office to a boarding house in Kensington. Late at night, he was seen developing photographs in a small basement darkroom. One evening, after several weeks of monitoring, they entered the room while he was away. Inside a drawer, they found undeveloped film rolls, pages of Allied documents photographed in perfect alignment. The evidence was irrefutable.
Hoffmann was arrested the following morning. He denied everything at first, but the microfilm found in his possession spoke louder than words. His confession came slowly, piece by piece, confirming the existence of the Cicero network. He named no handlers, only admitted that instructions came through coded letters from supposed relatives in Germany. Almost simultaneously, another raid targeted Maria Schroeder. Her small flat near Whitehall appeared ordinary until investigators found a false bottom in her cleaning trolley, lined with small envelopes of microfilm and partially burned notes. Her keys gave her access to nearly every restricted floor of the building. For years, she had collected discarded papers, sorted them by importance, and passed them through couriers. When confronted, she remained calm, even resigned. "It was never my choice," she reportedly said, "but it was my duty." She was detained under secrecy. Her quiet cooperation exposed the network's full structure. The last link, Ernst Vogel, vanished before authorities could reach him. His quarters were found empty, no luggage, no trace. Investigators discovered signs of a hurried departure, suggesting he'd been warned. His disappearance confirmed what many feared. The German intelligence still had ears inside the Allied system, feeding information even as arrests unfolded. The revelations sent shockwaves through London's war rooms. For months, the Allied command had fought an enemy that didn't exist, while the real one operated in their midst. The phantom listeners had been a mask, one that hid the faces of ordinary people carrying out extraordinary betrayal.
Berlin, upon learning that their network had been compromised, reacted swiftly. They doubled down on the deception. German broadcasts immediately announced new advancements in acoustic technology, claiming that the captured spies were simply decoys meant to confuse Allied intelligence. They released new photographs of gleaming machines, diagrams filled with technical jargon, and staged interviews with engineers describing vibration field resonance. The message was clear. The listening devices were still real. Incredibly, some Allied officers believed them. Even with proof of human espionage, the propaganda had worked too deeply. Some refused to believe that their walls had been breached by ordinary people. They preferred to believe in extraordinary machines. But for the first time, the illusion was cracking. A few senior commanders privately admitted that the phantom listeners had never existed. The truth, though painful, was liberating, because it meant the breach could finally be stopped. The new counterintelligence measures were swift and unforgiving. Personnel screenings expanded across all departments. Administrative access was restricted to essential staff only. Information flow became compartmentalized. No one person could now see an entire plan. The invisible war that had drained Allied morale began to shift. For the first time in months, the enemy had lost control of the narrative.
Yet the damage had already been done. Months of wasted resources, aborted missions, and paralyzed command decisions had given Germany precious time to prepare its defenses. The psychological cost couldn't be undone. But at least now, the Allies could see the deception for what it truly was, a masterful illusion sustained by fear. In Berlin, the remaining members of the Intelligence Directorate understood that the operation had run its course. Their listening technology myth would continue to serve propaganda purposes, but the real intelligence advantage was gone. The phantom listeners, once unstoppable, were silent at last. Still, in the quiet halls of Allied command, echoes of that deception lingered. The fear that had taken root was not so easily erased. Even with the spies gone, the walls still felt unsafe. Officers still lowered their voices without realizing why. The myth had been destroyed, but its shadow remained. The turning point had come, not with explosions or battles, but with a single captured courier whose briefcase cracked open one of the greatest illusions of the war. The Allies had finally found the truth, but the truth had arrived months too late.
Spring 1944. The phantom listeners were gone, but their echoes still haunted Allied command. The spy network had been dismantled. The false science had been exposed. Yet inside the walls of London's war rooms, the fear refused to die. Even as new battles loomed on the horizon, officers still spoke in cautious tones. Orders were written instead of spoken. The habit of suspicion had become permanent. Months earlier, Berlin had lost its hidden agents, but in the realm of perception, the Germans had already won something far more powerful: control over the Allied mind. The Germans' supposed acoustic intelligence program had been a masterpiece of manipulation. It turned their weakness into strength. Even as the Reich's armies lost ground, their propaganda created the illusion of technological dominance. The claim that they could hear through walls, that no secret was safe, still echoed in Allied intelligence reports long after its creators had moved on. Inside Allied command, many officers refused to believe that such a system had never existed. There must have been some form of it, one intelligence director said in a memo, perhaps smaller, experimental. Even with proof of human espionage, they struggled to let go of the idea that Germany's scientists had been years ahead. The myth had become more enduring than the truth.
The irony was staggering. The Germans had lost their network, but gained something less tangible, a psychological victory that no army could reclaim. For every mission delayed, every order second-guessed, and every discussion avoided, the cost had already been paid. The Allied command's most critical resource, trust, had been fractured. The toll was visible everywhere. Meetings that once lasted an hour now stretched into days. Joint operations between British and American forces required endless verification. Officers from different branches no longer assumed shared security standards. Every message, every report passed through multiple filters of paranoia. It was a bureaucracy built not for speed, but for self-protection. And that, for the Germans,
was the real triumph.
In Berlin, propaganda analysts studied Allied media coverage and intelligence leaks. They noted with satisfaction that even captured Allied soldiers spoke of German machines that could hear through walls. Newspapers in neutral nations repeated the claims. Even after the spy arrests, many articles speculated that the Germans had merely combined espionage with technology. The deception had achieved autonomy. It no longer required maintenance. It sustained itself through repetition and fear. For the Allies, the practical consequences were severe. Entire engineering divisions were diverted to projects designed to block resonance frequencies and neutralize vibrational eavesdropping. Steel-lined conference chambers were constructed across London and Washington. Complex white noise systems were tested in air bases and naval command centers. The funds spent on these efforts could have built fleets, trained pilots, or supplied divisions. Instead, they were spent chasing a phantom.
Operationally, the effects were measurable. Several missions scheduled for early 1944 were postponed under security review. Strategic communication between British and American commands was slowed by cross-verification processes. The delays didn't change the war's ultimate outcome, but they did cost time, and in war, time was life. The German deception had proven that information need not be true to be effective. It only needed to be believable enough to make the enemy act upon it. And the Allies, for all their resources, had acted exactly as intended. Even after the capture of Werner Hoffmann and Maria Schroeder, reports continued to surface describing strange acoustic phenomena. Officers heard echoes in rooms they swore were shielded. The sound of air vents became suspicious. A loose panel, a hum of machinery, even footsteps in another corridor could set off alarms. Rationally, they knew the myth was false, but emotionally, the fear remained real. That was the ultimate success of the Phantom listeners. Not in intelligence, but in imagination. Some within Allied intelligence began to reflect on the deeper meaning of what had happened. A few quietly admitted that the problem had never been German innovation, it had been Allied insecurity, the willingness to believe in an enemy's superiority rather than to question one's own vulnerability. As one analyst later wrote, "They didn't need to hear us. They only needed us to believe that they could."
Still, the Allies recovered. Once the spy network was eliminated, the fog began to clear. American planners resumed work on the massive operation that would define the war's final chapter, Operation Overlord. This time, the planning remained airtight. Meetings were held in secure underground facilities, personnel were screened twice, and documents were guarded by armed escorts. The lessons learned from the Phantom listeners shaped every detail of that operation. And when D-Day came in June 1944, the Germans had no warning. The deception that had once favored Berlin now lay shattered under the weight of Allied precision. For all its success, the Phantom Listener campaign had also carried a hidden cost for Germany. In chasing perfection in secrecy, they had devoted enormous resources to propaganda and psychological warfare, resources that might have reinforced their failing fronts. The illusion of technological superiority had given them prestige, but it couldn't stop Allied tanks. When the Allies finally crossed the beaches of Normandy, Germany's supposed mastery of intelligence meant nothing against overwhelming force. Yet even in defeat, the shadow of the deception lingered. Some Allied officers continued implementing anti-acoustic measures long after the myth had been exposed. The fear had become institutional, baked into military architecture, into training manuals, into security doctrine. Even by 1945, new American offices were still being built with soundproofing, just in case.
Historians later called it the invisible victory, a battle that Germany won not through firepower or code breaking, but through psychology. By exploiting human fear of the unknown, they had managed to slow one of history's most powerful military machines. They had made the Allies question themselves more than the enemy. But in the end, it was America's resilience that turned the tide. Once the truth emerged, the United States and its allies moved forward with renewed purpose. Factories roared back to full capacity, shipyards doubled production, airfields filled with new squadrons. Even propaganda could not compete with the reality of American industry. The phantom listeners could haunt the mind, but they could not stop the march of men and machines. As spring turned to summer and the invasion of France approached, Allied confidence returned. Not blind, but wiser. They had learned that fear itself could be weaponized, that deception could wound as deeply as battle. But they had also learned how to recover from it. The war had shifted from illusion to action. And while the Germans had won the battle of perception, the Allies were about to win the war of reality. For those who lived through the months of silence and suspicion, the victory would always feel bittersweet. They had overcome the shadow of an enemy that never existed, but the cost in time, trust, and the quiet toll of uncertainty was one they would never forget.
The war in Europe ended in the spring of 1945. The guns fell silent, the cities stood in ruins. And in the vaults of captured German ministries, Allied investigators began sorting through mountains of documents, files that held not just military orders, but the hidden machinery of deception. Among the archives of the German Intelligence Directorate, a set of folders drew particular attention. Inside were memos stamped Geheime Kommandosake, top secret. They outlined in chilling detail an entire propaganda campaign built around a fabricated listening technology. Each document described the same plan, to convince the Allies that Germany had developed a way to hear through walls. It wasn't a rumor created by journalists or rogue propagandists. It had been deliberate state policy. One memorandum, dated October 1943, read, "The objective is psychological paralysis. Enemy command must perceive omniscience in German observation. The more they believe, the slower they will act." Attached were notes referencing Allied broadcasts, photographs, and instructions for staging technical demonstrations using harmless radio equipment dressed up to look revolutionary. For investigators, the discovery was stunning. The entire phantom listener legend had been an illusion from the start, a story built from fragments of truth and stitched together by propaganda experts. The spy network's real achievements had been exaggerated and masked behind fake science to conceal their human origin. What the Allies had feared most, a machine that could hear their secrets, had never existed.
Dozens of similar documents surfaced across Europe. Reports from Berlin's propaganda ministry detailed coordination between the intelligence service and media outlets. There were schedules for radio announcements, scripts for broadcast speeches, and drafts of scientific explanations that sounded authentic but meant nothing. The deception had been orchestrated with military precision. Even the photographs of German engineers working on mysterious devices were staged. Many of the men in those photos weren't scientists at all. They were actors in borrowed lab coats. The Allied review committees studying these records struggled with disbelief. For nearly 2 years, the world's most powerful intelligence services had been misled by nothing more than a story. The psychological cost of that realization was heavy. The American Office of Strategic Services issued a confidential internal summary. The German success in the so-called phantom listener operation demonstrates that belief can serve as a weapon more destructive than ordnance. The target was not infrastructure, but confidence itself. In London, a similar conclusion appeared in British counterintelligence archives. Their assessment admitted that the myth had taken hold because it offered an easier truth than the alternative. It was simpler to fear the enemy's science than to face betrayal within one's own walls.
Those who had questioned the deception early, the few who had doubted the listening technology theory, were now vindicated. Among them was Major Richard Brennan, whose forgotten report from 1943 was finally rediscovered during the post-war audit. His memo, filed months before his reassignment, contained the exact outline of what investigators were now uncovering: human espionage disguised as technological terror. Brennan's name reappeared in internal correspondence. One note, dated July 1945, simply stated, "The conclusions of Major R. Brennan were accurate. His reassignment resulted in the loss of 6 critical months." But by then, Brennan was gone. He had been transferred to the Pacific Front and lost his life during a reconnaissance mission in 1944. He never knew he had been right. For others, vindication came quietly and without fanfare. The scientists who had argued against the physics of vibration listening received quiet commendations, but no public acknowledgement. Governments preferred the narrative that the technology had once been real and had simply been overcome. It was less embarrassing than admitting they had believed in a fantasy. The Allies had won the war, but in this small corner of history, victory carried an uncomfortable shadow. The post-war intelligence reviews concluded that Germany's propaganda had achieved its goal. It had slowed Allied operations, disrupted coordination, and eroded trust between partners. It had forced the enemy to fight a war within their own minds. The damage had not been physical, but psychological, and in some ways more lasting. The deception files were classified and sealed. Their contents were considered too damaging to morale and public perception. For decades, the story of the phantom listeners remained buried in archives, accessible only to a handful of intelligence historians. The public version of events spoke vaguely of advances in German listening systems that had later been neutralized. The true narrative, that fear itself had been the weapon, was quietly omitted. Even within intelligence circles, the lessons were difficult to digest. Officers trained after the war studied the operation as a case of psychological warfare at its purest form. The Germans had discovered that the mind could be more easily invaded than a fortress. Their innovation hadn't been a machine, it had been perception, the manipulation of what the enemy believed to be possible. By the end of 1945, the Allied review boards closed their final reports. Each concluded the same way. The phantom listeners did not exist, yet their influence was real. The deception succeeded because it was built upon fragments of truth, amplified by fear, and reinforced by human imagination. The reckoning was quiet, almost somber. The officers who had fallen for the illusion felt betrayed, not by the enemy, but by themselves. The idea that rational men could be led so easily into panic was unsettling. But out of that discomfort came an important evolution in Allied intelligence philosophy, an understanding that information warfare was not just about intercepting data, but controlling belief. As one American officer wrote years later, reflecting on those months of confusion, "The enemy taught us something we could never have learned through victory alone, that deception works best when it uses our logic against us." For the Allies, the war had been won, but the ghosts of the phantom listeners would linger, reminders of how, even in triumph, truth can arrive too late, and how the greatest victories sometimes emerge from the ruins of misunderstanding. By the time the war ended, the world had witnessed weapons of every kind: tanks, bombers, rockets, and the dawn of atomic power. But hidden beneath all the noise was another weapon, invisible yet devastating: the manipulation of perception. The operation, codenamed Phantom Listeners, proved something extraordinary: that fear could achieve what force could not. Germany had not needed new machines. It had needed only imagination, discipline, and an understanding of human psychology. They understood that what people believe shapes what they do. And in war, that belief could decide everything. When Allied investigators reviewed the captured German archives, they saw how meticulously the deception had been planned. The documents revealed the philosophy behind it. Control what the enemy thinks is possible, and you control what he dares to attempt. That single idea had guided every broadcast, every fake photograph, every rumor.
The Germans knew that the Allies trusted their own logic. They knew scientists would argue over technical plausibility, not emotional manipulation. They understood that the mere appearance of superiority could make an enemy cautious, and cautious enemies move slower. In a war measured in days and hours, that hesitation could change the course of history. For the Allies, this realization was deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't a failure of weapons or codes. It was a failure of confidence, a reminder that even the most rational minds could be guided by fear. The phantom listeners had not broken Allied communication lines. They had broken their sense of security. In the months following the war, American intelligence agencies began incorporating those lessons into new doctrine. The OSS, soon to evolve into the CIA, produced internal analyses describing perception warfare. They recognized that propaganda wasn't only about morale, it was about shaping the decision-making of the opponent. Every major power would study this model in the years to come.
The British reached similar conclusions. MI6 reports emphasized that psychological interference may prove as valuable as physical sabotage. Training programs after 1946 began teaching officers to question information that aligned too neatly with fear. The human tendency to assume the worst was now considered a vulnerability, one that future adversaries would certainly exploit. Historians later called this new understanding the invisible revolution. It shifted the way nations thought about intelligence. From that point on, wars would be fought not only for land or airspace, but for the human mind. The phantom listeners had shown that an army's greatest weakness might not be in its weapons, but in its assumptions. Even decades later, veterans of Allied command recalled the emotional toll of that deception. Some admitted that they had felt genuine paranoia, the sense that walls were alive, that every silence carried risk. One officer described it simply: "We weren't fighting Germany, we were fighting ourselves." That was the true brilliance of the operation. It turned the disciplined order of the Allied system inward, transforming unity into suspicion.
For the United States, the experience left a lasting mark. The nation that prided itself on technological might had been humbled by a lie. Yet from that humility came growth. American strategists began to focus not just on inventing new weapons, but on controlling information, both protecting it and manipulating it. They realized that in a world where radios, film, and newspapers reached millions, the battle for truth was as vital as the battle for territory. In Washington, a report circulated quietly among senior officials. The German deception demonstrates that superiority in production and manpower is insufficient. Victory demands dominance in narrative. The word narrative would become central to post-war strategy. The understanding that every fact competed with a story, and the stronger story always won. But within that lesson lay irony. The United States and its allies had eventually triumphed not because they mastered deception, but because they rediscovered conviction. Once the truth emerged, once the lies were stripped away, they returned to what they did best:
act decisively, create, and move forward. The Germans had conquered perception, but they could not sustain reality. Propaganda could distort the truth for a time, but it could not manufacture fuel, ships, or faith in a hopeless cause.
That was the deeper truth of the phantom listeners. Propaganda is powerful, but not omnipotent. It can shape minds, but it cannot build nations. It can create fear, but it cannot create hope. And in the long shadow of that war, hope proved the stronger force. For intelligence historians, the operation became a textbook case, studied not for its espionage success, but for its psychological precision. Every stage was dissected: the initial leak, the propaganda amplification, the Allied response, the eventual collapse. What emerged was a portrait of how easily perception could replace evidence when fear filled the gaps. Years later, when modern agencies studied foreign disinformation campaigns, they found echoes of the same principles first tested in 1943. The techniques evolved, but the logic remained identical: make the enemy doubt his own reality. The ghosts of the phantom listeners still whispered through the corridors of intelligence training programs across the world. And yet, for the Americans who lived through it, the story carried a more personal meaning. It reminded them that democracy, for all its strength, depends on trust. Once fear corrodes that trust, even truth begins to sound like rumor. When the final intelligence summaries were written in late 1945, one conclusion stood out. It said, "The Germans did not defeat us in information, only delayed us. Their triumph was psychological, not strategic. But the damage done to morale was as real as any battlefield loss." The Allied command had learned the hard way that the mind was both shield and target. It was a realization that would shape the Cold War to come, a world built on radio waves, ideology, and persuasion. From that moment forward, every whisper of propaganda carried the memory of a time when walls were feared to have ears. In the end, the phantom listeners became more than a wartime deception. It became a symbol, a mirror reflecting the fragility of human certainty. The Germans had crafted a story so convincing that even its victims helped spread it. And that was the ultimate paradox. The most dangerous weapon of all had been belief itself.